They say money buys comfort, security, and control. But what if one day you came home to find everything you thought you controlled, your house, your family, even your own child, was suddenly in the hands of a stranger? That's exactly what happened to Richard Harlow, a powerful millionaire whose world was built on steel, contracts, and absolute certainty. He never hesitated when making business decisions. He never let emotions dictate his moves, and he believed his fortune shielded him from chaos. But on one ordinary evening, Richard returned to his immaculate mansion, expecting the usual: his daughter playing in the garden, the staff preparing dinner, and silence across the marble floors. But instead, he froze in disbelief. Because right there, standing barefoot in the golden glow of sunset, was a frail, homeless woman. Her clothes were ragged, her hair tangled from the streets, and her hands clutched something Richard could not comprehend: his little daughter. The moment stretched like an eternity. Who was this woman? How did she even get past his gates? And more importantly, why was his precious child leaning into her arms as if she had always belonged there? This was the beginning of a story Richard Harlow would never forget. The story begins. Richard Harlow was the kind of man newspapers loved to feature. The self-made millionaire, the relentless CEO, the tycoon who grew an empire from nothing but grit. His life was planned down to the second. Every deal, every meeting, every handshake, calculated. But behind the headlines and polished photos, Richard lived a lonely life. His wife had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving him with their only daughter, Lily. She was just a child, fragile and bright-eyed, and she became his only reason to soften the edges of his otherwise hardened life. Illy was everything money couldn't buy. She laughed with a joy no gold could purchase. She asked questions no contract could answer. And she loved him not for his empire, but simply because he was daddy. And though Richard tried to give her the world, he often found himself too consumed by his empire to give her what she wanted most: time. That fateful evening. It was a Friday evening when Richard's car rolled up the long driveway of his estate. The iron gates closed behind him with their usual clang, and the fountain at the entrance sparkled with water catching the dying light. To Richard, it was just another evening, another quiet night before the next storm of business. But as he stepped out of his car, adjusting his cufflinks, something felt different. The usual chatter of staff was missing. The gardener's tools, normally stacked neatly, were scattered across the lawn. And then he heard it, a soft, almost lullaby-like hum drifting from the garden. Richard walked quickly, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel, and there, by the edge of the rose bushes, stood a sight that nearly made him stagger. A young woman, her clothes threadbare, her skin tanned from hardship, and her hands clutched something Richard could not comprehend: his little daughter. The moment stretched like an eternity. Who was this woman? How did she even get past his gates? And more importantly, why was his precious child leaning into her arms as if she had always belonged there? This was the beginning of a story Richard Harlow would never forget. Confrontation. Richard's first instinct was fury. He stormed forward, his voice sharp like steel. "Put her down! Who are you? How did you get in here?" The woman flinched, but didn't release Lily. Instead, she shifted her hold protectively, as if shielding the child. I didn't mean any harm," she stammered, her voice raspy. She was outside, by the gate, alone. I only wanted to keep her safe until someone came. Richard froze. His daughter, outside, alone. That was impossible. The estate was guarded, secure, yet Lily nodded innocently. I wanted to see the puppies by the gate," she explained, her small voice cutting through the tension. "And she found me before I could get lost." Richard's anger wavered. He looked at the woman again, truly looked. Her hands were trembling, not from malice, but from exhaustion. Her face was thin, her eyes hollowed from hunger, yet they held a strange gentleness. She was a stranger, a homeless woman who had wandered into his perfect world, and yet her daughter clung to her as though she had known her forever. And unlikely dinner guest. Normally, Richard would have called security. He would have removed her from the grounds without hesitation. But Lily's pleading eyes stopped him. "Daddy, can she stay? Just for dinner, please?" Richard hesitated. Logic screamed at him to say no. But something about the scene, the way his daughter looked at this stranger with trust, the way the stranger looked back with unspoken care, broke through his usual barriers. "Fine," he muttered. "One meal, then you go." The woman nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. Thank you, sir." Her name, he soon learned, was Sarah. At the dinner table, she sat nervously, her posture stiff, as though afraid to touch anything. The staff whispered, scandalized by our presence, but Lily was delighted. She chattered through the entire meal, telling Sarah about her toys, her favorite colors, her dreams of becoming a ballerina. And Sarah listened, really listened. With patience, with warmth, with the kind of attention Richard realized he rarely gave. Cracks in the Millionaire's walls. That night, Richard found himself watching Sarah when she thought no one noticed. She cut her food into the tiniest bites, savoring each morsel as though it were the most precious feast. Her eyes scanned the chandeliers, the paintings, the golden walls, not with envy, but with quiet wonder. Who was she, really? How had she ended up here, homeless, broken, yet still carrying herself with dignity? After dinner, when Lily fell asleep, Richard confronted her again. "You can't just appear out of nowhere holding my child," he said firmly. "What's your story, and why should I believe you mean no harm?" Sarah lowered her gaze. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then she spoke. "I wasn't always like this," she said softly. "I had a family once, a home. But life, it doesn't always go the way you plan. My husband died, I lost my job, then everything else followed." Her voice cracked, but she steadied it. "I didn't come here to steal. I didn't come here to take. I only wanted to keep your daughter safe, because once I couldn't keep my own safe." Richard felt something in his chest twist. A millionaire's dilemma. The logical part of Richard screamed to end this. She was a stranger, a liability, a risk. He should call the police, drive her away, erase this disruption from his perfect world. But then he thought of Lily's smile that evening. The way she had laughed, carefree in Sarah's arms. It had been so long since he'd seen her that happy. Richard clenched his fists. If Sarah held the key to his daughter's happiness, and perhaps even secrets of his late wife's past, then he would uncover it, no matter what it took. But deep down, he feared one thing most of all. What if Sarah wasn't a stranger at all? The mansion had always stood as a monument to Robert's success. Its tall gates, the sprawling driveway lined with imported oak trees, and the immaculately trimmed hedges were all carefully curated signs of wealth and stability. But that night, after discovering his daughter Emily in the arms of a homeless woman, the walls felt different, less like a fortress and more like a cage of secrets. Robert sat in his study, the dim glow of the fireplace flickering against the rows of leather-bound books. His glass of scotch sat untouched on the desk. His hands shook, not out of fear of the homeless woman, but out of the unease that she had stirred within him. Who was she? Why had Emily run to her as though they shared an unspoken bond? He replayed it in his head. Emily's laugh, soft and genuine, echoing through the foyer as she clung to the stranger's neck. A laugh he hadn't heard in months. For years, Emily had been quiet,
reserved, even withdrawn since her mother's passing. But in that moment with the homeless woman, Robert had seen a spark, a glimmer of life in her eyes, and that disturbed him more than anything. The housekeeper's whisper. The following morning, as Robert sat silently at the breakfast table, his longtime housekeeper, Maria, entered hesitantly. She was a woman in her late 60s, loyal to the family for decades, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. But today her brow was furrowed with unease. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "about last night." Robert raised his head slowly. "Yes, Maria? That woman, the one with Miss Emily, I recognized her." Robert's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, his tone sharp. "What do you mean you recognized her?"
Robert had always believed that money bought clarity. Contracts, transactions, and negotiations left no room for ambiguity. Everything was written, sealed, and enforceable. But when it came to Sarah, the homeless woman with haunted eyes and a quiet bond with Emily, he found himself in murky waters where wealth meant nothing. The morning after their encounter downtown, Robert was restless. He paced the marble hallways of his mansion, the echo of his footsteps following him like a relentless reminder of unanswered questions. Sarah had vanished into the night, leaving him with nothing but her name and a cryptic acknowledgement of his late wife. That single line, "She has her mother's eyes," gnawed at him. How could Sarah know Margaret well enough to notice such an intimate detail? Emily's innocence. Emily had always been perceptive. Robert often underestimated how much she absorbed, how much she saw. That morning, as Robert lingered by the breakfast table, Emily skipped into the room clutching a hand-drawn picture. "Daddy, look," she beamed, holding up the paper. Robert crouched to her level, studying the drawing. It showed 3 figures: a little girl with golden hair, a tall man in a suit, and a woman in a ragged dress holding hands with the child. "That's you, Daddy," Emily explained, pointing to the suited figure. "That's me, and that's Sarah." Robert's heart tightened. "Sweetheart, why did you draw Sarah?" "Because she tells me stories," Emily said matter-of-factly. "She says even when princesses lose their castles, they can still find families who love them." Her innocent words pierced Robert's chest like an arrow. His daughter was finding comfort in the company of a stranger, a comfort he had failed to provide. He smiled weakly, brushing a hand through her hair. "That's a beautiful drawing, Emily." But inside, he was more determined than ever to uncover who Sarah really was. The search. Robert's instinct as a businessman was to investigate. He contacted a private investigator he trusted, a man named Daniel, who had handled delicate matters for him in the past. Find everything you can on a woman named Sarah, mid-30s, homeless now, but she wasn't always. She might have lived near here years ago, and I believe she may have known my late wife. Daniel didn't ask questions. He never did. "I'll get back to you within 48 hours. The waiting gnawed at Robert. He threw himself into work at the office, but even million-dollar deals couldn't distract him. Every face he passed reminded him of Sarah's hollow eyes. Every moment he spent away from home made him worry Emily was sneaking back to the park, searching for Sarah. And deep down, Robert couldn't decide what he feared more, that Sarah was dangerous or that she was family. The revelation. 2 days later, Daniel arrived at the mansion with a thick folder. Robert dismissed the staff and led him into the study. "Tell me everything," Robert demanded. Daniel opened the folder and laid out several documents, photographs, and news clippings. "Her full name is Sarah Whitfield. She grew up in this city. 10 years ago, she was married to a man named Thomas Whitfield, and they had a daughter. But tragedy struck. Her husband was killed in a car accident. A year later, her daughter, only 6, fell gravely ill. Sarah couldn't afford the medical bills. She lost her house, her job, and eventually, everything." Robert swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "And the daughter?" Daniel hesitated. "She died in the hospital. Sarah never recovered.
She spiraled into poverty and disappeared from public record. Until now. Robert felt the room spin. He gripped the edge of his desk, trying to steady himself. He had expected pain in Sarah's past, but this was devastation. Daniel continued carefully. There's more. Before Margaret married you, she volunteered at the same hospital where Sarah's daughter was treated. Records show she spent a lot of time with Sarah and her child. Witnesses said the two women became close. Robert's breath caught. Margaret. My Margaret. She had never spoken of this part of her past. She had never mentioned Sarah. They were friends, Robert whispered. Daniel nodded. Very likely. Which means Sarah wasn't lying when she said she knew your wife. Confrontation. That evening, Robert returned to the park where Emily often played. He wasn't surprised to find Sarah sitting on the same weathered bench, her gaze distant, her posture weary. He approached quietly, his voice low but firm. You knew my wife. Sarah turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes. There was no denial, no attempt to deflect, only a sorrowful nod. Yes, she whispered. Margaret was my friend. She held my hand when my daughter was in the hospital. She comforted me when I thought I couldn't go on. She was light in my darkest days. Robert's throat tightened. Why didn't she tell me? Because Margaret was humble, Sarah said softly. She didn't brag about her kindness. She didn't see helping others as a story worth telling. She simply gave. And then she moved forward. Robert sank onto the bench beside her, torn between grief and awe. Emily, she's drawn to you, as if she can feel that connection. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Your daughter reminds me of mine. The same laughter, the same spark. I never meant to intrude. I only wanted to protect her, to give her the warmth I couldn't give my own child anymore. For a long moment, they sat in silence. The sound of children playing filled the air, mingling with the rustle of leaves. Robert finally spoke, his voice low. You're not a stranger anymore. You're part of my wife's story, and now part of Emily's. A choice of compassion. Robert could have easily pushed Sarah away, hired security to keep her from the estate, shielded Emily from her completely. It was what most men in his position would have done. But Robert wasn't most men anymore. Losing Margaret had stripped away the illusion that money could solve everything. And now, seeing Sarah's brokenness, he realized something profound. Compassion was wealth too. The following week, Robert arranged for Sarah to move into a modest guest house on the edge of his property. He offered her a job tending the gardens, a place where she could work quietly, away from judgmental eyes, while still being close to Emily. At first, Sarah resisted. Pride battled with desperation in her tired eyes. But eventually she accepted. Not because she wanted charity, but because she wanted proximity to Emily and to the memory of Margaret that still lingered in the mansion's halls. And slowly, something remarkable happened. Emily blossomed. Her laughter returned, her loneliness faded, and she began to share her mother's stories, ones that Sarah had told her, back to Robert. For the first time since Margaret's death, the mansion felt like it alive again. And Robert, once hardened by loss and blinded by wealth, discovered a truth he had long forgotten. Sometimes family isn't about blood or money. Sometimes it's about the broken souls who find each other and decide to heal together. I used to think life was a ledger. Debits, credits, measurable outcomes. Every deal, every handshake, every decision weighed against what I might lose or gain. But standing at the window, watching Sarah and Emily chase each other across the garden in the golden afternoon light, I realized the truth. The things that matter most are never written down. They live in laughter. They live in second chances. They live in the places where pain meets healing. And for me, that place was here, in the woman I'd once mistaken for a stranger, and in the little girl who was finally learning to be a child again.
The world outside pushes back. Of course, the world didn't make it easy. Reporters caught wind of the mystery woman living on my estate. Cameras camped outside the gates. Headlines screamed, "Millionaire takes in homeless woman. Who is she really?" I ignored most of it, but Emily didn't. One morning, she came into my office with tears in her eyes. "Daddy, why are they calling Sarah a thief? She's not. She's kind. She helps me. Why are they lying?" I pulled her into my arms, my throat tight. "Because sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand. But you and I, we know the truth." Sarah wanted to leave then, to protect us from the storm she felt she had caused. But Emily clung to her so fiercely that Sarah couldn't move, and I made it clear, "You're not running. Not this time. Not from this." The test of trust. The real test came during a board meeting. My company had just secured a massive contract, and my partners worried my personal scandal would ruin negotiations. One of them, an old friend, leaned across the table and hissed, "Robert, end this nonsense. Send her away. You're gambling everything you've built." I stood up, calm, steady. I spent years building walls so high even my own wife couldn't climb them. She carried secrets because she knew I wouldn't listen. Not anymore. If this company can't survive me choosing compassion over appearances, then maybe it's not worth having. The room went silent. That day, I stopped being the man who bowed to fear. Emily's awakening. Meanwhile, Emily thrived. She had always been a quiet child, hidden behind books and toys, speaking mostly in whispers. But now, she had a fire in her. She asked questions about her mother, about Sarah, about me. She wanted to know stories, memories, even painful truths. One evening, as Sarah tucked her into bed, Emily asked, "Sarah, why did Mommy love you so much?" Sarah froze, her eyes shimmering. "Because she saw me when no one else did, just like she saw you, just like I do." Emily smiled and whispered, "Then I'm glad you're here." I stood outside the doorway, unseen, my heart breaking and healing all at once. The last gift from Market. Months passed, and just as the noise from the outside world began to die down, something unexpected happened. While going through an old storage box of Margaret's belongings, Sarah found an envelope addressed to me. Inside was a journal, one Margaret had kept in the last months of her life. The entries were short but powerful. She wrote about her fear of leaving Emily behind, about her regret at not telling me everything, about the hope that one day Sarah and I would meet. One line, scrawled shakily near the end, read, "Robert is stubborn, but he loves deeply. If Sarah ever finds her way to him, let him see her the way I do, as family." I cried for the first time in years, and when I showed it to Sarah, she cried too. It was as if Margaret had reached across time, across grief, to stitch us all together. Making it official. It was Emily's idea, of course. "Daddy," she said one evening, "can Sarah stay forever? Not just in the cottage, in the house, with us, like family." Sarah tried to protest, but Emily stomped her foot the way only children can. "No, Sarah, you're mine now. Mommy wanted you here. I want you here. And Daddy smiles more when you're here." Out of the mouths of children come the simplest truths. That night, I asked Sarah to move into the main house. Not as a guest, not as a shadow, but as a part of us. She hesitated, tears in her eyes, before whispering, "Are you sure?" I nodded. "Margaret chose you. Emily chose you. And now I choose you." Healing the past. The transition wasn't perfect. Some neighbors turned their backs. Some employees quietly resigned. There were awkward dinners, uncomfortable questions.
moments where Sarah felt the weight of judgment. But there were also breakthroughs. Emily, who once flinched at the mention of her mother, began speaking freely about her again, telling stories, asking questions, even laughing. Sarah began painting again, covering canvases with colors that brought our home to life. And I started walking through the halls without the hollow echo of loneliness following behind. A new chapter. On the anniversary of Margaret's passing, the three of us stood together in the garden she loved. Emily placed flowers on the bench, Sarah lit a small candle, and I read aloud from Margaret's journal. We didn't mourn that day. We celebrated. We celebrated the woman who had tied our lives together in ways none of us could have foreseen. And as the sun dipped low, Emily slipped her hand into Sarah's and whispered, "Thank you for keeping Mommy alive in my heart." Closing reflection. If you had told me a year ago that a homeless woman would walk into my life and change everything, I would have laughed, or worse, dismissed it as impossible. But life has a way of breaking us open in the places we guard most fiercely. Sarah taught me that. Emily reminded me of that. Margaret, even in her absence, ensured that love would not be buried with her. Today, when people look at me, they still see a millionaire, a businessman, a man with influence. But when I look at myself, I see something different. I see a father who learned how to listen. I see a man who learned how to love without fear. And most of all, I see a family that was never supposed to exist, yet somehow, against every odd, became the truest thing I've ever known. Because sometimes the family you end up with isn't the one you plan for. It's the one that shows up at your doorstep, carrying your daughter, carrying your past, carrying the piece of your heart you didn't even know was missing. And that is the wealth no fortune can ever buy.